The winter bobcat rescue that changed an old man's life forever. The wind arrived first, a low moan that built into a shriek by late
Are
afternoon.
you cold, little
Harold Grant
one?
stood at his kitchen window
I'll
watching the
warm you
sky
up.
darken from gray to charcoal, the trees at the forest edge bending like old men against the gusts. He was 74 years old and had seen plenty of Vermont winters. But something about this storm felt different, heavier, more personal, like it was coming specifically for him. He checked the wood stove, added 2 logs, and adjusted the damper. The small flame inside flickered and caught, sending a brief warmth across the kitchen. The power had gone out an hour ago, no surprise there. The lines along the valley were old and temperamental. Just like him, he wrapped his thick gray sweater tighter around his chest and moved to the porch door. Outside, the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the last hour. Snow was beginning to fall, not the gentle kind that drifted down in Christmas card formations, but hard pellets that stung his face when he stepped onto the porch. He squinted toward the chicken coop near the trees. The birds would need checking, the generator too. That was when he noticed Rusty was missing. The old rust-brown cat usually spent afternoons curled in the warmth near the wood stove. His favorite spot since Eleanor passed. Harold stood still, listening past the wind. Nothing. He called once, twice. The wind swallowed his voice. He went back inside and pulled on his heavy coat, the canvas one with the worn elbows. His boots were by the door, still damp from the morning. He forced his feet into them and stepped back onto the porch, this time with the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The beam cut through the darkness and swirling snow. He swept it across the yard, past the woodpile, toward the coop. The chickens would be huddled together by now, their small bodies pressed close for warmth. He should have checked on them earlier, but the cold made his joints ache and he had put it off. He was halfway to the coop when he saw the shape. Rusty stood at the corner of the coop, his body rigid, his fur slicked down by the snow. The cat was staring directly at him, unmoving. Harold stopped. In 10 years, he had never seen Rusty look like that. Not afraid, but urgent, focused. The cat turned and scratched hard at the coop door, the wood splintering slightly under his claws. Then he stretched his whole body upward, reaching as high as he could, and looked back at Harold. The message was clear. Harold's heart began to pound. He hurried forward, his boots crunching through the snow, the flashlight beam bouncing. When he reached the door, Rusty darted inside through the gap at the bottom. Harold pulled the door open, the hinges groaning against the cold. The smell hit him first. Damp straw, chicken droppings, and something else. Something wild. He swept the flashlight across the interior. The chickens were clustered in the far corner, agitated but unhurt. And there, in the opposite corner, half buried in the straw, was a small shape. Harold stepped closer, his breath catching. A bobcat kitten. It was tiny, maybe 8 or 9 weeks old. Its spotted fur matted and soaked through. Its eyes were swollen nearly shut, and one back leg was twisted at an odd angle. The kitten was shivering so violently that the straw around it trembled. When Harold knelt down, it did not move, did not hiss, did not even seem to register his presence. He reached out slowly and touched its side. Cold. So cold the fur felt frozen. The kitten's breathing was shallow and rapid, each exhale a small puff of condensation in the frigid air. Harold sat back on his heels. His mind raced through the facts. This was a wild animal, a bobcat. Keeping it was illegal. The authorities would have fined him, maybe worse. But outside, the storm was reaching full strength. The wind howled like something alive and furious. The temperature would drop below 0 tonight. If he left the kitten here, it would be dead by morning. Rusty moved closer and pressed his body against the bobcat's side. The old cat began to purr, a low rumble that seemed impossibly loud in the small space. He licked the kitten's head once, twice, his rough tongue smoothing down the wet fur. Harold made his decision. He removed his coat, the canvas one Eleanor had mended 3 times before she died, and wrapped it around the kitten. The small body barely made a bulge in the fabric. He lifted it carefully. cradling it against his chest, and stood. His knees protested, but he ignored them. Rusty followed him out of the coop and across the yard. The snow was falling harder now, the flakes so thick Harold could barely see the porch light he had left on. By the time he reached the door, his shoulders were covered in white and his fingers were numb. Inside, the kitchen was still warm from the wood stove. He moved to the far corner, away from the drafts, and knelt on the floor. He needed something soft, something warm. His eyes landed on the blanket folded on the bottom shelf of the linen closet. Eleanor's blanket. It was pale blue with white embroidered edges, the kind of handwork no one did anymore. She had made it the year they were married, 52 years ago, after she passed. He had washed it once and put it away. He could not bring himself to use it or throw it out, so it sat there, untouched, a ghost of fabric. He stood and retrieved it, the wool soft under his fingers. He spread it on the floor near the stove and carefully laid the kitten down. The small body barely made an indentation. He removed his coat from around it and covered the kitten with a corner of the blanket. Rusty immediately curled up beside it, his body pressed close, his warmth beginning to seep into the frozen creature. Harold sat back and watched. The kitten's eyes were still closed, but its breathing seemed slightly less labored. Just slightly. He did not know what to do next. He had raised chickens, fixed tractors, mended fences, but he had never cared for a wild animal, especially not one this young. This hurt. He looked at the kitten's face, the small muzzle, the tufted ears. Despite the swelling and the injury, there was something fierce about it, something that refused to give up. A fighter. The name came to him then, sudden and clear. Scout. He did not know why. Maybe because the kitten had wandered so far from its mother. Maybe because it reminded him of the brave ones, the ones who went ahead into the unknown. Or maybe it was just the way it lay there, small and determined not to die. Harold stood and moved to the cupboard. Milk. He had some in the icebox, kept cold by the snowstorm now that the power was out. He poured a small amount into a bowl and warmed it over the wood stove, stirring it with a spoon until it was just above room temperature. Then he found an old medicine dropper from the back of the drawer, the one Eleanor had used for her pills. He knelt beside Scout and dipped the dropper into the milk. Carefully. He pressed the bulb and drew up a small amount. Then he touched the dropper to Scout's mouth. Nothing, he tried again, letting a single drop fall onto the kitten's lips. Scout's tongue moved, just barely, licking at the moisture. Harold felt a surge of hope. He gave another drop, then another, slowly, patiently. He dripped milk into the kitten's mouth, one drop at a time. It took nearly an hour. By the end, Scout had swallowed perhaps a tablespoon. It was not much, but it was something. The kitten's breathing had slowed and deepened. Its body had stopped shivering quite so violently. Harold sat with his back against the wall, watching. Rusty had not moved from Scout's side. The old cat's eyes were half closed, his purring constant and steady. Outside, the wind continued to howl, rattling the windows and shaking the roof. But inside, in the small circle of firelight, three beings rested together. Harold's eyelids grew heavy. He had not slept well in years, not since Eleanor died. The bed felt too big, too empty. Most nights he dozed in the chair near the stove, waking every few hours to add wood. But tonight, with Scout and Rusty nearby, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt needed. He whispered into the darkness, his voice barely audible over the wind. I am not alone anymore, my love. He did not know if he was speaking to Eleanor or to Scout or to the empty air. It did not matter. The words were true. He closed his eyes and let sleep take him. When he woke, pale gray light was filtering through the windows. The storm had passed. He sat up slowly, his back stiff from sleeping on the floor. Rusty was still beside Scout, his body curled protectively around the kitten. Scout's eyes were open now, narrow slits that gleamed in the morning light. Harold stood and added wood to the stove. Then he prepared more milk, warming it carefully. This time, Scout drank more readily, the small tongue lapping at the dropper. When the kitten finished, it closed its eyes again and pressed its head against Rusty's side. Harold stepped onto the porch. The world was white. Snow covered everything, smooth and unbroken except for the tracks he had made the night before. The sky was clear now, a sharp cold blue that promised more freezing temperatures. He heard the sound of an engine in the distance. A few minutes later, David's truck appeared at the end of the long driveway, moving slowly through the snow. Harold watched as his old friend parked and climbed out, carrying a canvas bag in one hand and a thermos in the other. David was 68, a former park ranger who had retired to a cabin 2 miles down the road. He and Harold had known each other for 30 years, since David had first moved to Vermont. They saw each other once or twice a week, usually over coffee or to trade firewood and supplies. David climbed the porch steps and handed Harold the thermos. Figured you might need this. Power's still out. Harold nodded. Probably be another day or two. David followed him inside, stamping snow from his boots. He set the canvas bag on the table and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. Firewood in the truck, and Judas sent bread. Harold set the thermos down and turned to thank him. But David had already seen Scout. The older man crossed the kitchen in 3 long steps and knelt beside the kitten. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he looked up at Harold, his expression unreadable. How long? Last night, found it in the chicken coop. David reached out and gently touched Scout's injured leg. The kitten flinched but did not cry out. David's jaw tightened. He examined the wound closely, his fingers careful and experienced. Steel trap. See the cut pattern, clean edges. Someone set it close to the forest line. Harold felt his chest tighten. Hank? David nodded. Most likely, he has been trapping again even though the season is closed. I have warned him twice. But he does not care. Says it is his land and he will do what he wants. They both knew Hank. He owned 100 acres on the north side of the valley and had a reputation for ignoring regulations. He set traps, shot deer out of season, and cut timber without permits. The rangers had fined him multiple times, but he always paid and went right back to doing what he wanted. David stood. You know you cannot keep it. I know. The regulations are clear. Wildlife rescue requires a permit, and bobcats are protected. I know. David looked at him for a long moment. Then he sighed. All right, I will help you. But it cannot stay in the house. Too risky if anyone comes by. Together they moved Scout to the grain shed behind the house. It was old and drafty, but David helped Harold block the gaps with spare boards and pile the floor with clean straw. They brought Eleanor's blanket and 2 more from the house. Rusty followed them and immediately settled beside Scout, his eyes watchful. David examined the leg again in better light. Not broken, just badly bruised and cut. Keep it clean and it should heal. The eyes are infected, though. That will take longer. He retrieved a small bottle from his truck and showed Harold how to apply the ointment. Twice a day, and keep giving it milk. It is too young for solid food yet. When David left, Harold stood in the shed and looked down at Scout. The kitten was watching him, those swollen eyes somehow conveying both wariness and trust. Rusty pressed closer and began to groom Scout's head, his tongue working carefully around the injured areas. Over the next 3 days, a routine developed. Harold woke early and prepared warm milk. He brought it to the shed and fed Scout with the dropper, watching as the kitten grew stronger and began to take more. Rusty stayed with Scout almost constantly, leaving only to eat and use the litter box Harold kept near the house. On the 4th day, something changed. Harold entered the shed and found Rusty sitting near the door, his posture stiff. Scout was sitting up, looking toward the small window near the ceiling. The kitten's ears were forward, alert, and from somewhere deep in the forest came a sound, a long, low growl, not threatening, searching. Scout's mother, Harold, stood frozen. He had not thought about the mother bobcat, had not considered that she might still be out there looking for her lost cub. The sound came again, closer this time. Scout made a small, chirping noise, almost like a bird, and tried to stand. The injured leg buckled, and the kitten fell. Rusty immediately moved to Scout's side, pressing against the kitten as if to hold it down, to keep it safe, or to keep it from leaving. The calling continued throughout the night. Harold lay awake in his bed, listening. He knew what it meant. Scout was healing. Scout would want to go back, and he would have to let it happen. But not yet. The leg was not strong enough yet. The eyes still needed care. The next morning, he found Scout at the shed door, scratching weakly at the wood. The kitten looked at him, then at the forest, then back at him. The message was clear. Harold knelt down. "Not yet," he said quietly. "You are not ready." He did not know if Scout understood, but the kitten stopped scratching and allowed Harold to pick it up and carry it back to the nest of blankets. That afternoon, Harold set up a litter tray near the door, the same kind he used for Rusty. He had read once that wildcats could be trained like domestic ones if they were young enough. Rusty seemed to understand what Harold was trying to do. The old cat walked over to the tray, stepped inside, and very deliberately demonstrated its use. Scout watched from the blankets. The next time the kitten needed to go, it stumbled over to the tray and tried to copy Rusty. It got the front paws in, but left the back paws out, resulting in a mess on the floor. Harold cleaned it up without comment. The second attempt was better. Scout got all four paws inside, but then, apparently exhausted by the effort, simply lay down in the clean litter and fell asleep. Harold stood in the doorway, watching the small spotted body curled up in the box, and felt something break open in his chest. He laughed, actually laughed, a sound he had not made in 3 years. Not since the morning he found Eleanor in the garden, collapsed among her tomatoes, gone before the ambulance could even arrive. Rusty walked over to the litter tray, looked at Scout, looked at Harold, and made a sound that might have been the cat equivalent of a sigh. Then he curled up beside the tray and closed his eyes. That night, Harold sat on his porch with a cup of tea, watching the stars emerge. The sky was clear and cold, the kind of night where every constellation stood out sharp and bright. Scout was doing better. The leg was healing. The eyes were less swollen. In another week, maybe 2, the kitten would be ready. He tried not to think about what came after that. From the forest edge came the sound again. The mother bobcat calling for her cub. Scout would hear it in the shed, would want to answer, but it was not time yet. Harold finished his tea and went inside. He added wood to the stove, checked that the doors were locked, and went to bed. But sleep did not come easily. He lay in the darkness, listening to the wind and the distant calling, and wondered what Eleanor would have said about all of this. She would have helped. He knew that. She had always been the one to rescue injured birds, to trap the feral cats and get them fixed, to leave food out for the foxes in winter. She would have wrapped Scout in her blanket without hesitation, but she would also have been practical. She would have reminded him that Scout was wild, that it belonged in the forest, not in a shed behind their house, that love sometimes meant letting go. He closed his eyes and pulled the blanket up to his chin. Tomorrow he would call David and ask about removing the traps from the forest. Tomorrow he would worry about what to do when Scout was fully healed. Tonight, he would just let himself be grateful that the small, spotted creature was alive, in the shed. Rusty woke to the sound of movement. Scout had climbed out of the blankets and was standing at the door again, listening. The kitten's injured leg was stronger now, bearing weight almost normally. The eyes were clearer, the infection fading. Rusty stood and walked to Scout's side. He pressed his body against the kitten and began to purr. Scout turned away from the door and followed the old cat back to the warmth of the blankets. Outside, the mother bobcat called once more, her voice carrying across the frozen valley. Then, as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, the forest fell silent. The rumors started on a Tuesday. Maggie Fletcher lived in the yellow house at the crossroads, the one with the wraparound porch and the wind chimes that never stopped singing. She was 79 and had lived in the valley her entire life. She knew everyone's business, or thought she did, and she made it her personal mission to keep the community informed. She had seen David's truck at Harold's place 3 times in 1 week. She had noticed Harold carrying something wrapped in blankets to the old grain shed, and she had very keen hearing, good enough to pick up strange sounds when she drove past Harold's property on her way to town. On Tuesday morning, she stopped by the sheriff's office with a basket of muffins and a heart full of suspicion. Carla Hayes sat behind her desk, reviewing paperwork from a break-in at the hardware store. She was 46, lean and strong from years of hiking the mountain trails, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. She had been sheriff for 8 years and had earned respect through fairness and common sense. Maggie set the muffins down and leaned against the desk. Something strange is going on at Harold Grant's place. Carla looked up. Strange how he is hiding something in that old shed. David has been going there constantly, and I heard sounds, animal sounds. Maggie, Harold has chickens. Chickens make sounds. Not these sounds. These were different. Maggie lowered her voice. Wild, different. Carla set down her pen. She knew Harold. He was a good man, quiet and honest, but she also knew the regulations. If someone was keeping illegal wildlife, she had to investigate. It was her job. I will look into it, she said. Maggie smiled, satisfied, and left with her empty basket. That afternoon, Carla drove out to Harold's cabin. She found him in the front yard, splitting wood. The sound of the axe hitting the logs echoed across the valley. He stopped when he saw her truck and set the axe down. Carla! Harold. She climbed out and walked toward him. Got a report about unusual activity on your property. Maggie. Maggie. Carla almost smiled. Mind if I take a look around? Harold wiped his hands on his jeans. He could refuse. He could tell her to come back with a warrant, but that would only make things worse. And besides, he had known this was coming. Shed is out back. They walked together across the yard. Rusty appeared from somewhere and followed at a distance, his tail low. When they reached the shed, Harold pulled the door open. Scout was in the corner, lying on Eleanor's blanket. The kitten looked up at them, eyes clear and bright now, the swelling nearly gone. The injured leg was tucked under its body, healing but still favored. Scout did not move, did not hiss, just watched. Carla stood in the doorway for a long moment. She had been a ranger before becoming sheriff. She knew bobcats, she knew the regulations, and she knew Harold was breaking the law. How long? She asked quietly. A week. Found it during the storm. It was dying. You know I have to report this. I know. Carla stepped inside and knelt near Scout. The kitten's ears went back, but it did not retreat. She examined it from a distance, professional and careful. Then she stood and looked at Harold. If you saw a creature nearly dead in a snowstorm, what would you do? It was not really a question, more of a challenge, or maybe a confession. Carla had made that same choice before, years ago, with an injured eagle. She had kept it for 3 days, treated its wing, and released it when it healed. No one had known. No one needed to know. But Harold was not as lucky. Maggie had seen. Others would talk. 1 week, Carla said finally. I am giving you 1 week to figure out what to do. After that, I have to follow the law. Understood? Harold nodded. Carla walked back to her truck without another word. She did not write anything down, did not take photos. She simply drove away, leaving Harold standing in the yard with 1 week to make an impossible decision. That evening, David came by with a map of the forest. He spread it on Harold's kitchen table and pointed to red marks he had drawn across the northern section. Trap locations. I found 6 yesterday. All steel leg traps, all illegal this time of year. Hank set them near the game trails. Harold studied the map. We need to remove them. Agreed, but it will take time, and Hank will know someone was there. I do not care if he knows. David looked at him. This is about more than Scout now. It always was. They started the next morning. David brought bolt cutters and work gloves. They hiked into the forest, following the trails David had marked. The first trap was near a fallen log, half buried under leaves. David triggered it with a stick, and the metal jaws snapped shut with a sound that made Harold's chest tighten. This is what caught Scout, David said quietly. They destroyed it with the bolt cutters and moved to the next location. By noon, they had found and destroyed 4 traps. By evening, all 6 were gone. The pieces scattered deep in the forest where Hank would never find them. When Harold returned home, Scout was standing at the shed door. The kitten had heard him coming and was waiting. As soon as Harold opened the door, Scout chirped and pressed against his leg, the small body warm and solid. Rusty watched from his spot on the blanket, eyes half closed in approval. Over the next 3 days, Scout grew stronger rapidly. The leg no longer limped. The eyes were completely clear. The kitten began to play, stalking Rusty's tail and pouncing on shadows. Sometimes Harold sat in the shed and watched them. The old cat, and the young Bobcat, moving together like dance partners who had known each other for years. On the fifth day, Harold woke to find Scout standing on the porch. He had left the shed door open the night before, just a crack, to let in fresh air. Scout had pushed through and wandered to the house. Now the kitten stood at the top of the steps, staring toward the forest, not running, not crying, just watching. Harold stepped outside with his cup of tea and stood beside Scout. He placed his hand on the kitten's head, feeling the soft fur, the small skull beneath. Scout turned and pressed its face into his palm, eyes closing. In that moment, Harold felt something he had not felt since Eleanor died. Completeness, not happiness exactly, but the sense that he was where he was supposed to be, doing what he was supposed to do. He stayed there for a long time, his hand on Scout's head, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. But time kept moving. On the sixth day, Maggie returned. She brought 3 people from town with her, all of them curious and concerned. They wanted to see what Harold was hiding. They wanted to know if the rumors were true. Carla had no choice. She arrived shortly after, her face tight with regret. David was already there, standing beside Harold on the porch. "I'm sorry," Carla said. "I have to look." They walked to the shed together, the group trailing behind like a parade. Harold opened the door slowly. Scout stood in the center of the straw nest, fully visible in the morning light. The kitten's eyes were bright, its coat glossy and healthy. When the strangers crowded at the door, Scout's ears went back and a low growl rumbled in its chest. Rusty moved instantly. The old cat placed himself between Scout and the humans, his back arched, his fur standing on end. His eyes blazed with a ferocity Harold had never seen before. Carla raised her hand, stopping the others from entering. She looked at Scout for a long moment. Then she looked at Harold. 3 days, she said. I saw what I needed to see. You have 3 days to handle this properly. Maggie started to protest, but Carla silenced her with a look. The sheriff turned and walked back to her truck, the townspeople following. David stayed. When everyone was gone, Harold entered the shed and sat on the floor. Scout came to him immediately, climbing onto his lap like a house cat. Rusty settled beside them, his tail wrapped around the Scout's body. 3 days, Harold said softly. Those 3 days were the quietest of Harold's life. He did not talk much, he simply watched. He recorded everything in his mind. Knowing he would want to remember, he watched Scout eat, the small jaws working carefully on the pieces of chicken David had brought. He watched Scout groom Rusty, the rough tongue smoothing the old cat's fur. He watched Scout run across the yard, the injured leg now strong and sure, leaping over rocks and chasing moths in the afternoon sun. On the 7th day, Scout climbed onto the porch and sat there all afternoon, staring toward the forest. Harold sat in his rocking chair beside the kitten, saying nothing. The silence between them was comfortable and sad at the same time. When evening came, Scout went back to the shed, but Harold knew it was almost time. The next morning, Scout was gone. Harold found the shed door pushed open from the inside, the blankets undisturbed. Small tracks led from the shed across the yard to the forest edge, then disappeared into the trees. He pulled on his coat and followed. The forest was quiet, the morning mist hanging between the trees like ghosts. Harold walked slowly, his eyes on the tracks. They led deeper into the woods, past the old maple grove, toward the ridge where the hunting trails crossed. He called Scout's name. Once, twice. The forest swallowed the sound. He kept walking until his legs ached and his breath came hard. The tracks were harder to follow now, scattered across rocks and under fallen leaves. He stopped in a small clearing and leaned against a tree, exhausted. That was when he heard the rustling. Scout burst from the brush ahead, running toward him, but the kitten stopped halfway, turned, and looked back. An adult bobcat emerged from the shadows. She was thin, her gray-brown fur dull from weeks of searching. Her eyes were fierce and tired at the same time. She stood perfectly still, watching Harold with an intensity that made his heart pound. This was Scout's mother. Harold did not move, could not move. He was caught in something sacred, something that felt older than the forest itself. Scout looked at him, then at the mother bobcat, then back at him. The kitten walked forward slowly and pressed its head into Harold's hand one last time. He felt the warmth of Scout's fur, the solid weight of the small skull. He closed his fingers gently around the Scout's ear and whispered, "Go on now." Scout turned and walked to its mother. The adult bobcat lowered her head and touched her nose to Scout's face, a gesture so tender Harold felt tears sting his eyes. Then, moving as one, the two bobcats turned and disappeared into the forest. Harold stood alone in the clearing for a long time. The mist was lifting now, sunlight breaking through the canopy in golden shafts. Birds were beginning to sing. The world was waking up. He walked back slowly, his chest heavy, but not empty. When he reached the house, Carla's truck was in the driveway. She stood on the porch, waiting. "I came to check," she said. "It is gone." She looked at him, reading something in his face. "Back to the one, back to its mother." Carla nodded. She walked to the shed and looked inside at the empty blankets, the small tracks in the straw. Then she returned to Harold. "I think everything is all right here," she said. "I will follow my report accordingly." She drove away without writing anything down. Winter ended slowly. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass and mud. The days grew longer and warmer. Harold returned to his routines, splitting wood, tending chickens, mending fences. Rusty stayed close, sleeping in the spots where Scout used to rest, as if keeping them warm. When spring finally arrived in full, Harold was sitting on his porch one morning with his tea. The valley was green now, wildflowers blooming along the forest edge. Birds sang from every tree. He saw movement at the tree line. Scout emerged from the shadows, fully grown now, fur thick and glossy. The kitten was gone. In its place stood a young adult bobcat, strong and sure. But the eyes were the same, clear and bright and knowing. Scout was not alone. Two smaller shapes appeared behind, stumbling over roots and pouncing on each other. Kittens, maybe 6 weeks old, their spotted fur still fuzzy. Harold set down his teacup slowly. Rusty lifted his head from the porch boards and watched. Scout stood at the forest edge and looked directly at Harold. The bobcat did not come closer, did not call out, just looked. A long, steady gaze that said everything that needed saying. Harold raised his teacup in a small salute. He smiled. Scout turned and herded the kittens back into the forest. They disappeared among the trees, three shapes melting into shadow. Rusty made a soft sound and closed his eyes again. From that spring forward, Scout returned every year, sometimes in early morning, sometimes at dusk, always at the forest edge, never coming into the yard, but always stopping to look. And every year there were new kittens, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. They would peek out from behind their mother, curious and wild, while Scout stood watch. Harold was always there. Every spring, he sat on his porch with his tea, waiting. He never called out, never approached. He just lifted his cup in greeting and smiled. The years passed. Harold grew older, his hair completely white now, his movements slower. But every spring, he was there. And every spring, Scout returned. Eleanor's blanket stayed in the shed, washed and folded neatly. Harold could not bring himself to bring it back into the house. It belonged there, in the place where Scout had healed, a marker of something important, a reminder that he had been needed. The townspeople eventually learned the story. Maggie spread it, of course, but this time with admiration rather than suspicion. Harold Grant, the quiet widower, who had saved a bobcat and let it go, who had given it a chance at life and asked nothing in return. Children asked to visit, to see if they could catch a glimpse of Scout. Harold always refused, gently but firmly. This was not a show. This was private, sacred. David understood. He came by often, bringing coffee and firewood, sitting with Harold on the porch in comfortable silence. Sometimes they talked about the forest. Sometimes they said nothing at all. But David was always there when spring came, witnessing the yearly reunion. One April morning, when Harold was 79, he sat on the porch feeling more tired than usual. The winter had been hard on his joints. Getting out of bed took longer now. Walking to the chicken coop left him breathless. But when Scout appeared at the forest edge, He felt young again. This year there were 4 kittens, tumbling over each other in play. Scout watched them with the patient intensity of an experienced mother, occasionally nudging one back towards safety when it wandered too far. Harold lifted his teacup. Scout lifted her head in return, ears forward. They stayed like that for several minutes, 2 old friends sharing the silence. Then Scout gathered her kittens and led them back into the forest. Harold sat on the porch until the sun was high overhead. Rusty, now moving slower himself, climbed into Harold's lap and settled with a deep purr. "We did good," Harold said quietly. "We did real good." That night, he brought Eleanor's blanket into the house for the first time in years. He washed it carefully, dried it in the sun, and folded it at the foot of his bed. It still carried a faint scent of the shed, of straw and wood smoke and something wild. He slept better that night than he had in years. The pattern continued. Every spring brought Scout and her new family. Every spring brought Harold to his porch. The ritual never changed. The understanding never faded. People in town began to call it the blessing. When Scout appeared each year, it meant spring had truly arrived. It meant the forest was healthy. It meant hope was real. Harold never called it anything. He just called it his life. The unexpected gift that had come to him during the worst winter of his loneliness. A small, spotted kitten who had needed him as much as he needed to be needed. In his 80th year, Harold sat on his porch on a warm May morning. The valley was green and alive. Birds filled the trees with song. And there, at the forest edge, stood Scout. She was older now, too, her movements deliberate and careful. 3 nearly grown kittens stood beside her, tall and strong, ready to start their own families. Harold raised his teacup, his hand trembling slightly. Scout raised her head. They looked at each other across the yard, across the years, across everything that had happened between them. 2 survivors, 2 souls who had found each other in a storm and had held on. Rusty, 20 years old now and mostly deaf, pressed against Harold's leg and purred. Harold smiled. Scout turned and led her family into the forest one more time. But before she disappeared, she looked back. One long, last look. Harold lifted his cup higher. "Thank you," he whispered. The forest accepted them back. The trees closed around them. And Harold sat on his porch in the sunshine, feeling complete. That winter was the warmest he could remember. Not because the snow was light or the temperature mild, but because inside his small cabin, wrapped in Eleanor's blanket with Rusty at his feet, he felt surrounded by love. The love of a wife who had taught him to care. The love of an old cat who had shown him loyalty. The love of a wild creature who had reminded him he still had purpose. When spring came again, Harold was ready. He sat on his porch with his tea, waiting, and Scout came. She always came. She always would.